Hello, and welcome to a new season of Coffee with the Authors, a series of conversations about the craft and process of writing. I'm Sarah Bearup-Neal, Gallery Manager at the Glen Arbor Arts Center. This season, we're talking and exploring the concept of building, and no one better suited to do that than Traverse City poet and teacher Teresa Scollon. Her 2012 book, To Embroider the Ground with Prayer, is a collection of poems considering her father's illness, death, and the Michigan farming community in which she was raised. We'll break that down and talk about the process of building a collection of thematically linked poems that tell a singular personal story. Thanks to Cottage Books and the Glen Lake Community Library for their support of Coffee with the Authors. And hello, Teresa.
Good morning.
Good
Thank you for
morning.
having me.
Let's begin, and I will get the picture of your book. There we go, about which we're talking. This one begins with a poem, a memory from your childhood, and then it travels through time. It takes the reader on a tour of where you grew up in the Thumb, the people who live there, and interspersed are poems about your dad, his life, his illness, and his death. So let's begin by getting to know your dad. Tell me about him.
My dad was a farm kid who went to college in the 50s. He was the first one from his extended family to go to college and became a veterinarian. And the joke was he became a veterinarian because he was allergic to barn dust. And he ended up working in a lot of barns anyway, but he
Hmm.
became a country veterinarian, moved to the Thumb. He was a very, I mean, I'm completely biased, right? He was my dad, but he was a kind guy. He was very funny. He loved to make light of things. He was kind of a nice combination of an independent thinker and a man whose faith was really important to him. He was the kind of guy who would he just kind of add light and ease to a room when he walked into it. He was just easy to be around.
People have many facets to their personalities, don't they?
They do.
Your dad died in 2006.
Hmm.
Your book of poems was published in 2012.
Yes.
And you have poems about your father that reflect different periods of his life and the progression of his illness. So, when you learned your father was sick, how did you begin to observe him and how did you take in the events as they were unfolding?
So it was quite a shock. He was diagnosed with small cell lung cancer. He was given a terminal diagnosis. He lived for almost exactly a year. And I wasn't thinking about writing while we were going through this. He was really the center of the family. He was the center of gravity for the family. And it was terrible. It was horrible. We were really, really working hard to be present for him.
Hmm.
I was living in Wisconsin at the time and tried to be with him in Michigan as much as I could. Um, and I was writing in a journal, but not in an organized way. Um, so, uh, so going through a illness like that with a loved one just takes all your focus, all your concentration. So that's what I was doing at the time. And then afterwards, I felt that writing was a way to hang on to him a little bit, right? To hang on to the memories before they slipped away. So that's how I did it.
This is a process question, Teresa.
Sure.
Talk about the blueprint that guides you as you're building a book of poems that are unified by a specific person or event. Is there any blueprint?
No. There's no blueprint. So what I learned, I mean, the thing that's I love about writing a poem is you cannot plan it in advance. You don't conceive of it and then download it, right?
Mhm.
The process of writing is a process of discovering. It's very active process. You write a line and then this other idea comes from somewhere and you learn as you go. And the same was true about putting poems together into a book. So each poem speaks to the next poem in some way. And I tried a couple of different structures. There are a lot of poetry books that are written in sections. You'll see section 1, 2, 3, 4. This was not a section book. And my teacher at the time um, thought maybe an onion shape. There's a lot of different threads running through the book. And so there's a layer of village, there's a layer of family, there's a layer of just growing up as a person. And so each layer kind of speaks to the other. Ray Jacobic, who's a beautiful poet and painter from the East Coast, was working with her on putting the book together.
That's such a distinct visual.
The onion?
Yes.
Yeah.
Did you draw that out on your wall?
No, but I had the poems up on a wall. And I blue painter's tape is one of my favorite writing tools. So I just put things up and move things around and live with a poem for a while. Maybe you pencil out a line, pencil something in. No, visual arrangement is important. On the floor, I mean, I have animals, so I can't really put things on the floor. So I put things on the wall.
Let's have you read a poem from the book Friday Night the Whole Town Goes to the Basketball Game.
Okay,
This is quintessential small town stuff.
it is small town stuff. Yep, everybody's there. So, so this was written a long time ago. Not, current events. Our relationship with China are a little different now, maybe. Okay. Friday nights, the whole town goes to the basketball game. Nick said, "Listen, Bill, this is no joke. Chinese tanks, Bill, were spotted rolling up I-75. What you think you know about the United Nations is lies. Lies spread by an international conspiracy to take over our homeland. We've got to protect our country, protect our constitutional right to bear arms. But I'm ready. I'm ready. I've got guns and ammunition buried in my front yard. I'm warning you, you'll regret it if you don't do the same." Bill said, Nick, what are you thinking? What if the Chinese show up in February, Nick? This is Michigan, for Christ's sake. How are you going to get those guns out of your front yard when the ground is frozen? What are you going to do then, Nick?
The delight in that poem is the way you were able to capture the conversation and the conversational voice.
I like how people speak. It's interesting to me.
It is. And listening is a really good practice, I would imagine.
It is. Yeah.
When people write a memoir, I always wonder about their note-taking practices. Talk about how you recorded moments, events, phrases that found their way into the poems that became this book. Um, did you use contemporaneous note-taking, or was it a process of letting things stew, settle, and then you synthesized?
Wow, that's a lot. That's a great line right there.
Stew,
Stew,
settle, and
synthesize.
synthesize?
That's hard to say quickly.
No.
Um, it's kind of both. It depends. There's one poem in here. The title is going to escape me at the moment, but I was on the phone with my dad and I had the presence of mind to just jot down a few lines of conversation. But it doesn't always happen that way.
Hmm.
Sometimes it's just recalled. Sometimes it's made up. That I have one or two lines. The long poem in here, Drought Year, my dad told me a very short thing on the phone about how he had been driving around during a drought and it had started to rain, and he thought he saw the crops saying thank you. And uh, that moment really stood out to me. It was an example of his perceptivity, his perception. I'm not sure perceptivity is a word. Anyway, his perception, very fine, imaginative, um, grateful, spiritual. And so the rest of the poem, it's quite a long poem, but the rest of the poem was composed while I was walking between my car and work. A little bit more would come, just
Hmm.
trying to imagine how he was feeling, that whole context, trying to explain what it's like to grow up in a farming community, to be a farmer, to be reliant on cycles that you have no control over. Um, so sometimes notes don't give you that much, and sometimes they give you a kernel that you can build off of.
I think one of the most interesting things you just said was writing the poem as you're walking from your car to work.
Hmm. Walking's great. So is washing dishes. Those are two of my favorite uh, ways to work. You get something going, and then I have to move a little bit. I have to move my body.
There's a long documented connection between people who write and their walking habits.
Hmm.
So there you go. We'll have to add dishwashing to that.
Yeah, dishwashing's good.
This is not a sad book you've written. There are many wonderful vignettes. You've created them with humor and affection and a bunch of well chosen details. These are poems about your life, poems dedicated to your siblings, and the poem Reciprocity is about a recurring character, Horse Piss Wilson. So,
Hmm.
who was he and how did he get his name? And then, can you read Reciprocity?
I'm not sure how he got his name. I mean, that's how he was introduced to me. My dad slipped and called him that when he pulled in the driveway. So, um, if you go to the vet now, you make an appointment. There's a nice, beautiful office. But I grew up in kind of the old-fashioned way, where the clinic is where most people had a garage. It was right next to the house, and people didn't make appointments. If you were a farmer and you're going into town for something, you'd stop by, right? And you'd pick up whatever you needed, or um, you might call, but chances you'd take your chances. You'd come and you'd sit in the waiting room and wait for him to come home from farm calls. But during dinner, so basically there was no break for us. People could come and go at any time. So during dinner, I'm the oldest of five kids, and seven of us, plus a dog, would crowd around this little round table in front of the kitchen window. And somebody pulled into the driveway, and my dad turned around and said, "Oh, it's Horse Piss Wilson." So that's how I got to know. He went by HP, but he was known to others as Horse Piss. He was kind of a salty character.
And your poem Reciprocity really highlights that. Would you mind reading it?
Reciprocity. Horse Piss Wilson is out working in the yard. His wife leans out the kitchen window. HP, she says, you better get in here and get cleaned up, she says. Aren't you going to the neighbor's funeral? Hell no, he says. He ain't going to mine.
And I can just see Mr. Wilson going,
Not doing it.
not going to do it. One of
So
the,
these are stories that my dad told me, right? He was out and about um, talking to people, and I don't have as many stories from my mom, but these are stories from him about things that happened in the village.
one of the things that I like so much about poetry is that it is usually succinct. as opposed to an essay or a novel. Um, the writer skips over a lot of background information, scene setting, and then dives in, assuming that there are enough well-chosen details for the reader to hang on to as they work their way through the poem. Um, Talk about the ways that poetry is inherently limited. There's not a lot of real estate there, not a lot of square footage, and how that guides you through the poem making process.
Um, so it is a compressed form, right? And that compression dictates certain decisions, but it also is a source of power. It's a source of energy for the poem. Um, I kind of think about the process of writing is really you generate a lot of material and then you harvest.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when you're teaching, you talk to kids about an accordion. You generate, you distill, you generate, you distill, and look for language that's very chewy, like the sound is important, um, or it's a density of feeling or a density of sensory imagery. Um, so we're really trying to access the language of the body rather than abstractions, something very concrete. So I often think about how, if I'm reading a poem, how it will lay this next to that, right? And sparks might fly between. So I don't have to worry. There's no room for, kind of the connective tissue that you need for chronology. First this happened, then this happened, then
Mm-hmm.
this happened, this happened. Poems handles time differently. You're really more of a, it's not a chronology, although there are poems that are narratives. But for the most part, you're laying things together and seeing how they speak to each other
Mm-hmm.
or resonate. You're kind of tapping into the associative power of the brain, I think, of the mind.
Well,
It's hard to explain.
yeah, it's there's an element of metaphysicalness to it,
Yeah, yeah.
an abstraction. Um, so maybe this is a good time for you to read a poem that really,
It does
um,
that.
I think, exemplifies this small square footage characteristic of poetry. Would you read the poem A Visit?
Oh,
And
yes.
we'll come back on the other side, as they say on television.
What? Oh my gosh. Oh, I gotta remember what page this is on. Do
Page
you know?
65.
Thank you. Okay. So this is during the last month of my dad's life. I was home. A visit. Grove Weathers came to the house on a snowy afternoon. He brought 2 mason jars full of soup from Janine and insisted on leaving his boots in the breezeway. No sense bringing mud into the house. I brought him in his socks, and we stood over Dad where he lay dreaming in his recliner, wrapped in a crocheted afghan. I said, Dad, Grove is here. And Dad opened his eyes and smiled and said, Hi, Grove, or maybe, yes. I left them to visit, but came back when I heard silence and found Grove perched on the couch, his big frame hanging from his shoulders, his hands clasped. I sat down, uncertain, but something was called for. I didn't know if I'd ever talked with Grove before, but I'd known one of his boys, so I mentioned that. Grove told me about his heart operation, and I asked for a story of his pet lioness, now dead, named Susie. How he had loved her, not least because she'd once nipped a certain scornful country singer on the rear end, and that lady had required a little bit of medical attention. Do you know Grove's daughter-in-law had lunch in Chicago with someone who had heard of Susie the Lion? Isn't that something? Isn't it something how a story can travel? And all the while my father lay in his chair, traveling far into a story we could not follow, into a blessing beyond telling. I sat near my father and listened, and Grove brought stories of the ones he loved. We sat with our useless hands useless in our laps and did what we could do. In time, Grove went out to sit on the step and put on his boots and speak to my mother, who was puttering in the breezeway. I heard him say, "It makes you so damned mad when you think about all the worthless bastards out there." And my mother, who had told me, though she had already and permanently forgotten she had said this, who had told me she was choosing not to believe that Dad was dying, looked embarrassed and said, "Oh, Grove." But Grove was clear, and he had recovered his voice, and he asked her, "Well, don't you sometimes feel that way?" And my mother was unable to reply. Why did you choose that one?
Because I liked the detail at the beginning where you say Grove comes in with mason jar full of soup from Janine. You
Mm-hmm,
didn't tell us who Janine was. You didn't explain that people can or jar soup.
mm-hmm,
There's, but in the architecture of the poem, you seed it with enough little details that we can assume that Janine is probably Grove's wife,
mm-hmm. Yep.
and she's a good farm wife because she preserves food.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And
but
that's
there's,
what you do
go
when
ahead.
people are, and that's what you do when people are sick. You bring food. Um, that's just what you do. And so he did that, and he had mud on his boots, so he's going to take those off. I mean, I'm not conscious of those details, but looking back, I see how they, at some stage in writing the poem, I see how this creates a world, right?
Hmm.
How people are. This is customary.
Hmm.
They do.
There's
I interrupted you. Sorry.
there's so many words now in the world. Most of them
Some of
typed
them are true.
they're typed out and
Yeah.
spoken, and we can't get away from words. But I think our current time is a really good example of how more is not more.
Hmm.
Less could be a lot more, and well chosen could be a fine challenge
Hmm.
for all of us who speak words or write words. And poetry, especially the poems in this book, are a real good example of the process one goes through picking just the right words. The boots got left in the breezeway.
Yeah.
Don't want to bring the mud in.
Right. No sense in that.
No sense.
Yeah.
No sense.
I,
You,
I left out something
oh,
though
please go
that
ahead.
I was thinking of when I read this. So the line break is an essential tool for the structure because you can establish pace, right? You don't have much language, so you want to think about how do people move through rapidly? Do they slow down? And you can also pack it with um, different meanings. So, for example, when I sit down, I really truly had never talked to this man directly before, right? He was a friend of my dad's. But there they are. He doesn't know what to do. My dad's really kind of in and out of it.
Hmm.
And so the line, I sat down uncertain, there's a line break, and then, but something was called for, period. I didn't know. And then there's a line break. So you can highlight that I didn't know, and it can mean multiple things because it's in this line about what's called for, and it's also in the next line about whether or not I'd ever talked to him. So that's an essential tool for poets. Am I making sense?
Yes. I always have thought that punctuation, in the same vein,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
is one of the most creative and expressive tools we can bring to writing.
Yeah. Yeah, punctuation is very handy.
And the line breaks give you a chance to breathe in between.
Hmm. Some poets use breath, and it can indicate breath. Some poets use beats, like rhythmic beats, a certain number of beats per line.
Mhm.
For some, it's a visual thing. You can get visual effects off it. For most of us, I think it's a combination.
You have a new book that's been published called No Trouble Staying Awake. Let me see. Aha, there it is. Let me see if I can bring this fella up on our screen. No.
Want me to just
Yeah,
zoom?
show that guy.
There you
There's
go.
a turtle making
Yep,
a slow but steady path towards a body of water.
baby. Let me shout out to both presses. This is Wayne State University Press. They make beautiful, beautiful books. And this is part of their Made in Michigan Writers Series. And then this is from Cornerstone Press, which is out of University of Wisconsin Stevens Point, and they are working really hard to build a Midwestern literature. So I'm really, I've been treated very well by both presses.
That's a conversation for a whole other time.
Yes,
Um, but are there's regional poet voices, I would imagine.
yes,
So how we speak and think and express in the Midwest is distinct from the West Coast or the South or dot dot dot.
yeah.
Okay.
So poets talk a lot about place and
Yes.
how a geographical or cultural place infuses work, really. So yeah, there's definitely a difference.
No Trouble Staying Awake is the title of the collection of poems,
Mhm.
and it is also the title of one of the poems. And I wonder if you'll read a little bit because we don't want to give the whole thing away quite yet. We want people to read it in its entirety. But if you don't mind, could you read a little bit of the poem and then we'll talk about it?
Sure. And so the title actually comes from the last line in this poem. The
That's
title,
right.
in the basement at Child and Family Services, which is the local social services agency that serves um, families in the area.
Go right ahead.
So, okay. In the basement at Child and Family Services. Tuesday nights, the basement fills for foster parent training. We come just out of work, pressed for time before dinner. We introduce ourselves. We live in this town. We plan to adopt. We have our grandbabies now and have to get certified. I was a foster child myself. I have room. I have time. There's a child. Next to me, a man intently colors in a diagram. He has the thick body and clothes of a man who works outside. An earring glints from one ear. When called on, he nods at his wife, who speaks for them both. They thought they'd raised theirs, but the daughter's got so many problems, now they have her kids. The 4-year-old doesn't want to see his mother, even though the court requires it. He's mad. Only 4. Now the daughter is pregnant again by another man. They raised her. How could this happen? We nod. The man does not look up. He is bright with pain. And it goes on from there. It's a long poem.
It is, and it's well worth the time and the length. Uh, so let's do a little backstory. Um, where is this Child and Family Services? Is it in the
It's in
place where
Traverse
you
City.
live?
Yep, it's in Traverse City.
And how did you come to be there?
I went to foster parent training with a friend of mine. We had been talking about it, and so we went to the training for several weeks. And it was a very intense experience. um, several sessions, speakers. Um, it was beautifully thought out. Um, People related their own experience. Many of the people there had been foster kids themselves. So it was a time of a lot of storytelling and very intense stories, very painful stories. And also, it was, there's something quite beautiful to me about humans trying to do something good, trying to put something good
Mm.
in the world in the face of so much pain. And um, you asked earlier about the compression, about, real estate in a poem.
Mm-hmm.
So in a poem, I can lay together this moment, this moment, this moment, this moment, even though that happened over a several week period,
Mm-hmm.
um, because I'm thinking about key moments and not the whole story, you know. Anyway, that was where that poem started.
The first time I read this poem, it kind of knocked the wind out of me. The the stories that are conveyed in it are, some of them are brutal.
Hmm.
Um, it's a very affecting poem. That's the polite way to put it. Um, but the other thing I thought about after I got my breath back was, this poem is such a great example of how the arts provide us with powerful tools
Hmm.
and new vocabulary for talking about the world. So here's my question. The facts of this poem can be very painful to hear if
Hmm.
you're telling them to me in a face-to-face conversation, but somehow the poetic form, the written form, transforms all this and turns the impact up to 11. I think that has to do with the details you chose. So, how does poetry allow one to speak and frame ideas differently than how you might articulate them in a face to face conversation?
That's a big question, and I could probably only answer it partially.
Mhm.
Um, if I read someone else's work, let's say W.S. Merwin, for example, who's writing about big things. He was a survivor of the fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was, no, I'm sorry, I'm confusing two poems, two poets. Merwin, he's very interested in the world, right? He sort of restored an old um, rainforest in Hawaii that was a pineapple plantation, very concerned about things happening. But if I read a poem of his, it kind of creates some space around it. Like there's a gravitas. This is on the page. I have time to take it in. I can take a breath. I can I can read this poem and then I can let it sit with me for a while. It might come back to me, right? I remember that I read it. I remember a line from it. And Miłosz, who was the Polish poet, was the same thing, right? He was able to take huge events and make it readable. I don't know, that's hard to explain. As a writer, um, Gregory Orr is a poet who survived a terrible thing, and he writes about how writing in general, not necessarily poetry, but writing, is a way we can reorder and
Mhm.
sense of things that have happened to us. Um, we are not in control when it happens to us, but we can control how we put it down on the page. And there's something very healing in that. But your question is, as a reader, how does that work? And for me, it's something about um, it's given its own place in the world, in a poem. It's on a page. It doesn't have to compete. It doesn't have to raise its voice over the din of everything else. It's here. I can find it here. It has literal white space around it, but also a kind of a calm around it. Am I answering your question?
I think you're answering it very well.
Okay.
Um, Again, it's one of those things that one doesn't do succinctly. There,
Hmm.
it's that
Yeah.
onion again,
Yeah.
all those different layers.
There's this and there's that. Yep.
Last question. Are you a pen and paper gal or a type it out on the keyboard gal? How does what are your composing habits and materials?
I start with pen and paper. There are times when I start with a keyboard because it's working fast, but mostly I start with pen and paper and just start generating material and then go back and harvest. The moment where I move from pen and paper to the keyboard is an important moment. And sometimes I feel impatient and I want to go to the keyboard and I think, no, no, I need to let it ripen a little bit before I do that. It's a different process. I have access, it's freer off the keyboard. It's freer with just pen and paper. Um, I can add more things and I might get up and wash the dishes and then this also needs to go in there somewhere and I'll scribble it in the margin. But um, once I'm typing it, then I'm thinking about shaping it. I'm already shaping it.
Mhm.
Is it going to be tercets, 3-line stanzas? What's going to look like? And there are a number of stages there too. So I might take all the line breaks out of a poem and make different versions of it and hang it on my kitchen cupboards. 4-line stanzas, 3-line stanzas. They do different things.
Mhm.
Um, and take a good look at it over a few days. But some poems take years to write.
That's for darn sure.
Yeah.
And it's a good thing.
Yes.
We live in a time where talk about compression. The number of minutes and seconds it takes to do things, our perception of that has changed. And I think there's something to be considered about slowing down and sitting on things for a while,
Yeah.
letting them stew a little bit.
You learn things.
Yes. And things change.
Mhm. They do.
They do.
And that's true for the visual arts as well, I bet you would say.
Any creative process, I would apply that to. Um, Whether it takes place in a studio or out in the dirt in the backyard or the act of raising children, which is a creative process.
Mhm.
It's taking a beat with your child, I would imagine, is probably a good thing to do
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. And they need that too.
Teresa, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
want I want to make sure that people understand that you have 3 books of poems. Trees and Other Creatures was published in 2021.
Yep. That's from the Ann Arbor publisher, Alice Green.
And your poems are contained in a wide variety of collections. You are, among other things, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, an alumna and writer in residence at Interlochen Academy. You teach. You teach at the North Ed Writers Studio, which used to be the Front Street Writers program for high school students.
Mhm.
And you serve as senior editor along with Jennifer Yates for the literary journal Dunes Review.
Yeah.
And I thank you again for your gift of words and your perceptive storytelling.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
And thanks to everyone who watched. We'll see you next time.